For more than 6 decades, Jack DeJohnette had done what few men could. He turned the drums into a language of freedom. Each stroke of his hand was not just rhythm, it was emotion, rebellion, meditation, all woven into sound. On that cold October morning, the jazz world went still. News spread quietly. Jack DeJohnette, the heartbeat of modern jazz, had passed away at the age of 83. The official statement came through his family's Facebook page. It is with great sadness that we announce the death of Jack DeJohnette. He died peacefully in Kingston Hospital, New York, surrounded by his wife, family, and close friends. That message marked the end of an era. Over 6 decades of relentless creativity, of a man who never stopped searching for the truth inside every note. His wife, Lydia DeJohnette, later confirmed the cause, congestive heart failure, and almost instantly tributes poured in from every corner of the world, from musicians, critics, and fans who had once been moved by his fearless artistry. ECM Records, his musical home for more than half a century, released a statement that read like poetry. Jack carried the drums beyond rhythm. He turned them into a language of emotion. Then came the day of his funeral. It was held in Kingston, New York, not in grandeur or excess, but in the kind of simplicity Jack always preferred. There was no elaborate stage, no flashing lights, just a quiet room with his portrait, his beloved drum kit, and recordings of his most iconic works playing softly in the background. No long speeches, no religious rituals, only music, pure, unbroken, and eternal. Among the mourners were his lifelong friends and collaborators, Vernon Reid, Ralph Towner, and representatives from the NEA Jazz Masters, each offering short, heartfelt words. They didn't speak as colleagues, they spoke as disciples of a man who had taught them to listen, not just to sound, but to silence. And then came the moment that stopped time. Keith Jarrett, the reclusive genius who had vanished from the public eye for years due to illness, appeared quietly. He said nothing, no introduction, no words, just approached the grand piano and sat down. For the next 8 minutes, the hall held its breath. What followed was not a performance. It was a farewell, an unfinished conversation between two souls who had spent their lives speaking through sound. Jarrett's fingers moved softly, tracing the theme from Ruta and Daitya, the first album he and Jack recorded together back in 1971. Each note seemed to rise, hesitate, and fall like memories struggling to stay alive. Reporters from Downbeat and Jazz Times, who were present that day, described the piece as minimal, fragile, yet infinite. It was as though Jarrett was not playing music, but remembering it. Halfway through, he paused, eyes closed, voice trembling, and whispered only one sentence. He always listened. That's why we could play forever. When the final note faded into silence, Keith Jarrett stood, bowed his head, and left the hall without saying another word. He didn't need to. The music had already said everything. The ceremony continued with a video montage of Jack's life, prepared by ECM, featuring moments from a special edition, Standards Live, and Skyline. No applause followed, no curtain call, only quiet tears, and then the sound of Pastel Morning, one of Jack's final recordings, the song he personally chose to close his own story. His family later revealed that the entire service was kept private, with no live broadcast, a decision made to honor Jack's final wish. Let the music speak the last word. And so it did. In that still room in Kingston, surrounded by silence and sound, the world said goodbye to the man who had turned rhythm into a heartbeat and silence into eternity. Before he was a legend, before his hands carried the rhythm of generations, Jack DeJohnette was just a boy, curious, restless, and endlessly drawn to the mystery of sound. He was born on August 9th, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, a city already alive with music. The streets of his childhood pulsed with the echoes of blues clubs, gospel choirs, and brass bands, sounds that would shape him before he ever touched a drum. His father, Jack DeJohnette Sr., was a devoted lover of classical music. His mother, Eva Janet Wood, sang in the church choir, her voice filling their small home every Sunday morning. Between the disciplined beauty of classical symphonies and the soul-stirring depth of gospel, young Jack grew up surrounded by two worlds and learned early that music was both structure and spirit. But his heritage ran deeper still. His family carried a rich blend of African American and Native American roots, giving him a profound sense of rhythm and connection to nature, an awareness of pulse, breath, and silence. He would later say in interviews that this background shaped his entire musical vision. Rhythm isn't just time, it's a heartbeat. It's who we are. At just 4 years old, Jack began studying piano under Antoinette Rich, a patient teacher who quickly realized this was no ordinary student. He had perfect pitch, a gift that allowed him to recall melodies after hearing them only once. By age 10, he could play complex pieces from memory. Yet something inside him was still searching. At 13, he found his true voice, not in the piano keys, but in the drums. He once explained, "I wanted a more physical connection to music. I needed to feel it through my body, not just my fingers." When his hands met the sticks, something awakened. Every hit, every brush carried not just rhythm, but emotion. It wasn't about keeping time, it was about shaping it. The 1950s Chicago scene became his playground and his classroom. He absorbed the city's heartbeat, bluesmen on the South Side, bebop in smoky nightclubs, gospel choirs roaring on Sundays. He studied the masters, Ahmad Jamal, Max Roach, Art Blakey, and learned how to make rhythm breathe. In his teenage years, Jack studied piano at the Chicago Conservatory of Music, but he never limited himself to one instrument. By day, he practiced scales and harmony. By night, he sat behind the drums in small bars and church halls, playing for the sheer joy of discovery. He soon joined the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, AACM, a bold collective of young artists like Muhal, Richard Abrams, and Anthony Braxton, who were determined to break free from the constraints of traditional jazz. They didn't want to imitate, they wanted to invent. It was here that Jack's musical philosophy began to crystallize. He realized that freedom in music wasn't chaos, it was conversation. The artist didn't dominate the sound, he listened to it. Jack once reflected on those early years with a quiet smile. Chicago gave me the rhythm that could breathe. He didn't know it then, but these lessons of balance, silence, and flow would one day shape him into the man who redefined what jazz drumming could be. By the early 1960s, Jack DeJohnette had become more than just another drummer in Chicago. He was a force quietly forming in the underground. The city's music scene was a storm of ideas, and Jack stood at its center, blending the discipline of classical training with the instinct of improvisation. He was barely in his 20s, yet his sense of rhythm was already extraordinary. When he played, the drums didn't sound like percussion. They spoke. Audiences could hear emotions between the beats, as though each strike carried a secret meaning. Jack played anywhere he could: jazz clubs, church halls, late-night sessions in South Side basements, where music and rebellion were one and the same. He was fearless, eager to experiment with tone and tempo, using symbols to paint atmosphere and silence to sculpt rhythm. Those who heard him perform at that time often described the experience as transformative. He wasn't following the beat, he was building it moment by moment. It was during this era that Jack joined forces with some of Chicago's most daring artists. He performed with Muhal Richard Abrams' experimental band, played for Sun Ra's orchestra, and immersed himself in the avant-garde wave sweeping the nation. Each night pushed him further beyond traditional jazz boundaries. Jack recalled, every session felt like opening a new door. Sometimes it was beautiful, sometimes chaotic, but it was always alive. As his confidence grew, so did his reputation. Word spread across the Midwest about this young drummer who could shift from thunderous power to delicate whisper, sometimes within the same bar. Producers began calling, and soon he was being invited to record in New York, where the next chapter of his life awaited. But before he left Chicago, he made one final transformation, a leap of faith that would change his destiny. In 1966, Jack packed his drums and left for New York City, the heart of the modern jazz revolution. It was a brave move. He had no fame, no promise of security, just an unshakable belief that his music would find its place. Within weeks, that belief was rewarded. He crossed paths with Charles Lloyd, a visionary saxophonist searching for a drummer who could blend a structure with freedom. Lloyd later said, Jack had balance. He could drive the band without overpowering it. Jack joined the Charles Lloyd Quartet, alongside a young pianist named Keith Jarrett and bassist Cecil McBee. No one knew it yet, but this trio would redefine jazz for a generation. Together they toured across Europe, performing for crowds who had never heard American jazz, played with such fearless grace. Amid the countercultural wave of the 1960s, their music became the sound of freedom itself, a reflection of the era's search for identity and truth. For Jack, these were years of discovery and transformation. Night after night, he learned how to shape silence, how to listen deeply, how to play not just with others, but for them. When asked years later what he took from that period, Jack said softly, I learned that music doesn't need to be forced. It breathes if you let it. That lesson would guide him for the rest of his life. By the late 1960s, the world of jazz was shifting, faster, louder, and more electric than ever before. And right in the center of that storm stood Jack DeJohnette, ready to redefine what rhythm could mean. After leaving the Charles Lloyd Quartet, Jack began performing in New York's late-night circuit. Small clubs, experimental studios, and impromptu jam sessions that went on until dawn. He played with Freddie Hubbard, Betty Carter, Stan Getz, and countless others, musicians who were pushing jazz toward its next great transformation. Then in 1969, fate intervened. Jack was performing with Bill Evans at London's legendary Ronnie Scott's Club when a quiet man walked into the audience, Miles Davis. Miles didn't clap, he didn't smile, he just listened, eyes locked on the drummer. After the set, he walked backstage and said just 3 words that would change everything. Let's play, man. That was all. No audition, no discussion, just an invitation from the greatest innovator in jazz to join his revolution. Soon after, Jack officially joined Miles Davis's band, stepping into the seat once held by Tony Williams, one of the most revered drummers of the era. It was both an honor and a test, and Jack rose to it instantly. He became part of a group that would go down in history: Miles Davis, Wayne Shorter, Chick Corea, Dave Holland, and Jack DeJohnette. Together, they were inventing something the world had never heard: the sound of fusion, where jazz met rock, funk, and the uncharted territory of the future. Jack's drumming during this era was electric, thunderous yet precise, capable of both grounding the chaos and fueling it. He brought a sense of movement that was almost architectural, shaping each piece like a living structure of rhythm and silence. Critics called it controlled madness. Miles called it pure fire. In those years, Jack was no longer the quiet boy from Chicago. He was the pulse of Miles Davis's revolution, a new voice that bridged the past and the future. By the end of the decade, his reputation had exploded. He was now a drummer every great artist wanted to play with, a musician whose touch could lift any performance from great to transcendent. But Jack wasn't satisfied with fame. He wanted freedom, the chance to explore his own vision of sound. So when his time with Miles ended, he turned to the one person who understood that hunger completely: Keith Jarrett. Together they began a new chapter, one that would carry them beyond genre, beyond definition, into the sacred space where music and emotion became one. It was time to enter the ECM era. The sound of silence turned into art. In May 1971, the world of modern jazz quietly changed forever. Inside Sunset Studios in Los Angeles, two visionaries, Jack DeJohnette and Keith Jarrett, sat down to record an album that would redefine the soul of improvisation. The project was titled Ruta and Datia. For the first time, there was no leader, no accompanist, only two equals creating a dialogue in sound. Jarrett played piano, organ, and flute. Jack filled the air with his drums, cymbals, and subtle percussion, weaving atmosphere out of silence. The result wasn't just music, it was a conversation between spirit and sound, between stillness and movement. Critics would later say that Ruta and Datia captured something rare: the sense that music could breathe, that each note was born and died in the same moment, perfectly balanced. Released in 1972 under the ECM Records label, the album became the foundation of one of the most important artistic partnerships in the history of jazz. For Jack, ECM was more than a record company. It was a home for imagination, a place where he could explore, experiment, and break free from convention. Throughout the 1970s, Jack recorded a string of groundbreaking albums. He embraced electronics in Sorcery, fused funk and jazz in Cosmic Chicken, and pushed the limits of acoustic sound in new directions, collaborating with John Abercrombie, Lester Bowie, and Eddie Gomez. Each album carried his unmistakable signature: the mix of discipline and chaos, the pulse that never stopped breathing. ECM founder Manfred Eicher once said, "When Jack enters the studio, he doesn't need charts, he just needs silence." Jack didn't play the drums, he painted with them. He treated every sound, even silence, as an instrument. When others used rhythm to keep time, Jack used it to tell stories. In 1980, he formed his own group, Special Edition, bringing together a new generation of musicians like David Murray and Arthur Blythe. It was a turning point, the moment Jack shifted from collaborator to leader. Special Edition wasn't about perfection. It was about exploration, a declaration that jazz was not a style, but a living organism. As the years passed, Jack's partnership with ECM deepened into something spiritual. He became not just an artist of the label, but one of its defining voices. His sound, airy, spacious, and emotionally raw, helped shape the entire identity of ECM. By the late 1970s, he had played on dozens of sessions with legends like Jan Garbarek, Ralph Towner, John Abercrombie, and Pat Metheny. Each project revealed another layer of his genius, his ability to adapt, to listen, to make music feel both infinite and intimate. Critics began to notice something profound. Jack DeJohnette wasn't just drumming, he was sculpting sound itself. Every beat had breath. Every pause carried meaning. As one jazz historian later wrote, Jack taught us that silence is part of rhythm, the heartbeat between two notes, and that truth would soon reach its purest form when Jack and Keith Jarrett, alongside bassist Gary Peacock, formed a trio that would become legendary. It wasn't just another collaboration, it was destiny, the creation of the Standards Trio, a union that would redefine the soul of modern jazz. By 1983, Jack DeJohnette and Keith Jarrett had already shared a decade of musical discovery. But what came next would elevate them from collaborators to legends. That year, along with bassist Gary Peacock, they formed the Keith Jarrett Trio, later known around the world as the Standards Trio. Their mission was simple but revolutionary: to play the old jazz standards, not as museum pieces, but as living, breathing conversations between equals. As Keith once said, everyone was waiting for a moment to just sit down and play. For Jarrett, who had spent years exploring solo improvisations and free-form experiments, this trio represented a return to simplicity and a soul. And for Jack, it was a return to the essence of what rhythm meant, not to impress, but to express. Their first album, Standards, Volume 1, released in 1983, became an instant landmark. From the opening notes, it was clear that this wasn't a typical piano trio. There was no leader, no follower, only balance. Keith didn't dominate the melody. Gary didn't just hold the harmony. And Jack didn't simply keep time. They existed as three voices breathing in unison, shaping sound as though it were one consciousness. Jack once said, "We played like three breaths of the same body." Every performance became a meditation, fluid, spontaneous, and deeply human. They could stretch a standard into a quiet storm, or compress an improvisation into a whisper. The audience never knew what would happen next, neither did the trio, and that was the beauty of it. Over the next 3 decades, the trio released a breathtaking series of recordings: Standards, Volume 1 and 2, Changes, Whisper Not, Tokyo 96, Always Let Me Go, My Foolish Heart, and Somewhere. Each album was like a journal entry, a snapshot of their emotional state at that moment in time. Their 1992 performance at Deerhead Inn became the stuff of legend. In a small, intimate room filled with just a few dozen listeners, the trio played for nearly 2 hours. No set list, no rehearsals, no retakes. When ECM later released the full concert, critics called it the perfect night. Not because of technical perfection, but because it captured what jazz was always meant to be: pure conversation. ECM's signature recording philosophy amplified their magic. No edits, no studio tricks. What you heard was exactly what happened: raw, unfiltered, and deeply alive. For more than 30 years, the Standards Trio never changed members, never followed trends, never argued in public. They didn't need to chase attention. The music itself was enough. As Keith's playing grew more introspective, Gary's tone became gentler and Jack's drumming softer. Their sound evolved into something transcendent, a quiet dialogue between wisdom and time. Younger musicians, from Bill Stewart to Antonio Sanchez to Brian Blade, all credited Jack as their guiding light. Antonio once said, "Listening to Jack taught me that silence is rhythm too." Through every beat, Jack reminded the world that music wasn't about control. It was about trust, the trust between three men who no longer needed words. By the 2010s, the trio's performances had become rare. Keith's health began to decline, and by 2014, he gradually withdrew from live performance. There was no formal announcement, no farewell tour, just a quiet understanding among those who knew them. The Standards Trio had completed its journey, but the echo of what they created, that sacred balance between heart and sound, would never fade. By the 2010s, time had slowed, but Jack DeJohnette's rhythm never truly stopped. Even as age crept in, his creativity refused to fade. He continued composing, recording, and teaching, carrying within him the pulse of 6 decades that had shaped modern jazz itself. In 2012, the United States honored him as an NEA Jazz Master, the highest recognition given to those who defined the genre. When he stepped on stage to receive the award, he didn't boast or reminisce. He simply said, "It's been a long journey, but I still feel like a student." That single sentence revealed everything about Jack, the humility of a man who, after conquering the world, still believed there was something left to learn. 10 years later, his brilliance would once again light up the stage. In 2022, Jack joined Gonzalo Rubalcaba and Ron Carter to record Skyline. 3 generations of jazz united. Ron, the master of the past. Gonzalo, the voice of the present. And Jack, the bridge that connected them. When Skyline won the Grammy Award for Best Jazz Album, the audience rose in thunderous applause. Jack, smiling softly, stepped to the microphone and said, "At this age, I just wanted to keep playing and smiling." The simplicity of his words moved the room to tears. Because for Jack, the music was never about fame, it was about joy. As the 2020s unfolded, his health began to decline. Yet he kept working, releasing sound travels and The Old Country, projects that proved imagination could outlive the body. Even when his hands grew tired, his mind still danced with rhythm. He revisited his archives, working with ECM to preserve his life's work, every note, every recording, every heartbeat of sound. When heart failure finally forced him to rest, he prepared his affairs with the same grace that had defined his music. His wife, Lydia DeJohnette, later shared, "He was calm, grateful, and surrounded by love. There was no grand farewell. He left in the quietness he always sought." And in that quietness, the music world paused once more. Tributes came from every corner, from Tokyo to Paris, from New York to Buenos Aires. Young drummers spoke of him as their compass, their teacher, their silent mentor. Keith Jarrett, too, released a final statement through ECM. Like me, Jack lived inside the chemistry that defined modern jazz piano trios. What we shared can't be replaced. It only exists in sound. ECM confirmed that Jack's legacy would live on. Dozens of unreleased recordings, spanning from the 1970s through the 1990s, were being restored and prepared for release. Even in death, his rhythm would continue to echo, his drums still speaking to those who listened deeply enough. And so, when Jack DeJohnette left this world at 83, he didn't really disappear. His rhythm still pulses through time, a quiet heartbeat beneath every stage, every jazz club, every young artist daring to play without fear. Because Jack didn't just play drums, he turned rhythm into a language of freedom, a language that will keep speaking long after the last note fades. If you cherish Jack DeJohnette's legacy, share his story so more people can learn about the man who taught the world that silence too can sing. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that honor the legends who shaped the sound of our lives.